Hello and welcome to a new Sunday series. I was faced with a choice of several books, but I narrowed it down to two. The Railwayman by Eric Lomax. And then I came across this book, The Burning Heart, John Wesley, Evangelist, by an author called A. Skevington Wood, who at the time of writing, which was 1967, and this edition was published in 1978, I'm not sure if this is reproduced. What I'm doing is reproduced or transmitting this. I don't even think the publisher exists. I'm pretty sure it'll be fine. But at the time of the writing of this book, this chap, Skevington Wood, was a minister of a Methodist church in York. And I assume he might still be there, I don't know. At the time, he was also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the president of the British Christian Endeavour Union. And he's an author of several books. So I'm going to skip the preface and I'm going to read to you the introduction and chapter 1, in part 1, The Making of an Evangelist, and it's just simply called In a Line, but I'm going to read to you the introduction first, which is 7 pages, I think, and it's quite small print, so it may take a bit of time, 6 and a bit pages. So first, the introduction. In England, the first half of the 18th century was a period of moral disorder. With that observation of Harold Nicolson, most historians today would be in substantial agreement. Neither the more balanced approach to the century, which has marked recent research, this is now the last century of course, nor the greater leniency with which its lapses are treated, have noticeably mitigated the gravity of the overall picture. Whilst it is never an easy matter to assess the conditions of a previous age and unduly sweeping generalisations are to be avoided, yet it does not seem open to serious doubt that the nation was on the verge of moral disintegration. It was to this catastrophic situation that John Wesley addressed himself under guard when in 1739, as Neville Williams puts it in his book Life in Georgian England, published in 1962, he, quote, made the vital innovation of becoming an itinerant preacher. It has been usual to assume that 18th century England had recovered to some degree from the extreme libertinism of the Restoration era. There is, however, sufficient evidence to show that, in the early years at least, the entail was considerable. Contemporary voices were open, and notorious for hypocrisy was not one of them, as Canon Elliot Binns remarked in his book The Early Evangelicals, published in 1953. The first two Hanoverian monarchs were flagrantly dissolute. The Prime Minister for 20 years, 1722 to 1742, Sir Robert Walpole, lived in undisguised adultery with his mistress Maria Skellet, whom he had installed at the Old Lodge in Richmond Park. Lord Chesterfield, in his letters to his son Philip, instructed him in the strategy of seduction as part of a polite education. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu declared that in society the state of matrimony is as much ridiculed by our young ladies as it used to be by young fellows. In short, both sexes have found the inconveniences of it, and the appellation of rake is as genteel in a woman as a man of quality. This prevalent moral laxity was both reflected in and fed by many of the amusements then in vogue. The present great licentiousness of the stage was conceded even by a man of the world like Lord Hervey. Joseph Addison, writing in The Spectator earlier in the century, remarked, "It is one of the most unaccountable things in our age that the lewdness of our theatre should be so much complained of, so well exposed and so little redressed. It is to be hoped that at some time or other we may be at leisure to restrain the licentiousness of the theatre and make it contribute to the advancement of morality and to the reformation of the age. The truth of it is, the accomplished gentleman upon the English stage is the person that is familiar with other men's wives and indifferent to his own, as the fine woman is generally a composition of sprightliness and falsehood." Later, it is true, David Garrick valiantly attempted a remedy, but even his success was restricted by the fact that many playgoers preferred the rank indecency of Restoration drama. The fashionable court and subscription masquerades were scandalously sensual. Champagne, dice, music, or your neighbour's spouse, these were advertised on one of the invitation cards. On a royal occasion, a maid of honour, impersonating Iphigenia, was so naked that you would have taken her for Andromeda. The popular taste in literature was no less demoralised. The notorious Minerva Press pandered to the current demand for titillation. In one of his Edinburgh Review's essays, Lord Jeffrey complained in retrospect that a greater mass of trash and rubbish never disgraced the press of any country than the ordinary novels that filled and supported circulating libraries. The staple of our novel market was beyond imagination despicable, and had consequently sunk and degraded the whole department of literature of which it had usurped the name. Meanwhile, the nation found itself enmeshed in the twin snares of drink and gambling. Insobriety was a vice from which no class was immune. Amongst the juvenilia of George Crabbe is to be found a satire in which he depicted the effects of intemperance on each segment of society, from the staggering peer to the humble pensioner, not excluding the slow-tongued bishop, the easy chaplain, and the convivial vicar. According to W.E.H. Lecky, the passion for gin drinking began to affect the masses of the population around 1724 and spread with the rapidity and the violence of an epidemic until it was irrevocably implanted in the nation. The gambling craze was equally obsessive. Public gaming houses were officially licensed. Facilities were amply provided for faro, basset, ombre, dice, and similar games of chance. In the two parishes of Westminster, no less than 296 tables catered for one fashionable form of gambling alone. All classes, from members of the royal family to city apprentices, were swept along by the prevailing tide, with disastrous effects not only on the pocket but on morals too. According to Sir George Otto Trevelyan, society in those days was one vast casino. It was said that before he had reached the age of 24, Charles James Fox was in debt to Jewish money-lenders to the tune of £100,000, which he had lost at cards and dice. £100,000 in the 18th century was an extraordinary amount of money when you consider that some Methodist ministers lived on £10 a year, and he was £100,000 in debt. Horace Walpole noted with concern that the gaming at Almack's, which had taken precedence over White's as the premier club, was worthy the decline of our empire or commonwealth, which you please. The young men of the age lose £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 in an evening there. To make matters worse, the government itself at once exploited and inflamed the universal desire for gain by sponsoring state lotteries. The moral decline of the nation was further indicated by widespread indulgence in such cruel and degrading sports, if such they can be called, as cock-fighting, cock-throwing, goose-riding, dog-tailing, bull-baiting, and badger-baiting. Meanwhile, the statistics of violent crime soared alarmingly, and hangings became so frequent that Dr. Johnson ironically expressed his fear lest the Navy might run short of ropes. There was as yet no organised police force, and many crimes went unpunished. Prisons were overcrowded and tended rather to harden offenders than to reform them. Gangs of young hooligans roamed the city streets, often clashing with their rivals or assaulting unprotected citizens. A committee set up by the House of Lords to examine into the causes of the present notorious immorality and profaneness discovered the existence of a club whose members were known as blasters. They professed to be votaries of the devil, addressed blasphemous prayers to him, and drank his health. And you can see that in Luke Tyerman's The Life and Times of the Reverend John Wesley, Volume 1, published in 1870. This alarming and extensive lowering of moral standards stemmed from a prior indifference to the claims of the Christian faith. As Lecky commented, a religious languor fell over England. Vital Christianity was at a premium. The bulk of the populace failed to recognise its relevance. Some of them, indeed, continued to perform what the philosopher Immanuel Kant called the court duties of religion, but comparatively few had experienced the glowing reality of personal communion with Christ. I suppose it will be granted, wrote Dean Swift in a project for the advancement of religion, 1709, that hardly 1 in 100 among our people of quality or gentry appears to act by any principle of religion, that great numbers of them do entirely discard it, and are ready to own their disbelief of all revelation in ordinary discourse. Nor is the case much better among the vulgar, especially in great towns. Before his death in 1708, William Beveridge, Bishop of St. Asaph, deplored the fact that Christ's doctrine and precepts are so generally slighted and neglected, and that so little of Christianity is now to be found amongst Christians themselves. To our shame be it spoken. In 1722, Daniel Defoe declared that no age since the founding and forming of the Christian Church in the world was ever like, in open avowed atheism, blasphemies and heresies, to the age we now live in. In 1729, John Barham, the hymn writer and pioneer of shorthand, told his sister Phoebe he had just bought a copy of William Law's Serious Call, but for Mr. Law and Christian religion and such things, they are mightily out of fashion at present. In 1738, George Berkeley, the Bishop of Cloyne, reported that morality and religion in Britain had collapsed to a degree which was never known in any Christian country. And in the same year, Thomas Secker, the Bishop of Oxford, lamented that an open and professed disregard of religion is become, through a variety of unhappy causes, the distinguishing character of the age. In 1751, Joseph Butler, the Bishop of Bristol, and author of the famous Analogy of Religion, described the climate as truly for nothing, but against everything that is good and sacred among us. In 1753, Sir John Barnard, an outstanding Member of Parliament, on whom the elder Pitt conferred the title the Great Commoner, which later devolved on him, regretted the fact that at present it really seems to be the fashion for a man to declare himself of no religion. Now, even if we concede with Dr. Rowland and Stromberg that the testimony of idealists, impassioned or disillusioned, is properly subject to some discounting, such a chorus of complaint can nevertheless hardly be ignored. Without at all seeking to darken the mind before the dawn of revival in any illegitimate manner, we are surely justified in concluding that Wesley appeared on the scene when faith and morals in England had sunk to an abnormally low ebb. For this, of course, the Church itself must shoulder a considerable share of responsibility. When every conceivable allowance has been made for the Hanoverian establishment, it can scarcely be regarded as having brought an aggressive impact to bear on a godless and decadent age. The most that has been demonstrated by recent investigation is that 18th century Anglicanism, and in particular the episcopate, was not quite as effete as it had been formerly painted. That it failed to meet the challenge of the hour in positive, heroic action is, however, an unfortunate and, to some, an unpalatable defect, which no amount of casuistical special pleading can amend. It is easy to exaggerate the deadness of the established church in the 18th century, writes Dr. Dorothy Marshall, but apart from the non-jurors, it was not a body of martyrs. Nor was it a body of evangelists either. Indifference in the world, claimed Dr. Campbell Morgan, is largely the result of passionlessness in the pulpit. Here lay a major failure of the Hanoverian Church. Walpole's policy of quieta non movere had affected the clergy. The homiletical model was Archbishop Tillotson. Enthusiasm was to be avoided at all costs. Sir Leslie Stephen said of the most celebrated preacher of the period, Hugh Blair of Edinburgh, that he was a mere washed-out retailer of second-hand commonplaces who gives us the impression that the real man has vanished and left nothing but a wig and gown. Oliver Goldsmith passed this judgment on the divines of his time. Their discourses from the pulpit are generally dry, methodical, and unaffecting, delivered with the most insipid calmness, insomuch that should the peaceful preacher lift his head over the cushion, he might cover his audience, instead of being awakened to remorse, actually sleeping over his mechanical and laboured composition. More serious than the lack of fervour in the Hanoverian pulpit was its distinct distrust of theology. Biblically based doctrinal preaching was at a discount. Tepid, innocuous moralising seems to have been the accepted recipe. Evil and guilt, sin and redemption, the whole personal drama and appeal of religion was forgotten or rationalised away, and the eupeptic optimism of politicians pervaded the teaching of the Church, according to Dr. J. H. Plum. It was not a religion which had much appeal to the men and women living brutal and squalid lives in the disease-ridden slums of the new towns and mining villages. They needed revelation and salvation. Dissent was only a little less culpable in this respect than the Church of England. It was this inculcation of a bare morality, unassociated with the evangelical truths of the Christian faith, which alone can bring ethics to life, which made so pathetically little impact on the congregations that the nation drifted to the brink of moral bankruptcy. "We have preached morality so long," complained Thomas Jones of Southwark, "that we have hardly any morality left. And this moral preaching has made our people so very immoral that there are no lengths of wickedness which they are not afraid of running into." If, however, we are to trace the source of moral decline in the 18th century, we must go behind the indifference of the people and the ineffectiveness of the clergy to a prior and determinative factor. It used to be fashionable to depict the 18th century as an age of stability so far as the foundations of Christianity were concerned. The deistic controversy, it was assumed, had turned out rather to the furtherance of the gospel, in that those who had dared to attack the revelatory basis of belief had been convincingly routed. But nowadays it is being appreciated that this was something of a Pyrrhic victory. Despite the apparent triumph of orthodoxy, severe losses had in fact been sustained. As Canon Elliot Binns remarked, "It took long for this to be realised, for casualty lists are not issued after such warfare." In meeting the onslaught of deism, orthodoxy gambled on reason, so Stromberg concludes. Temporarily it seemed as if this ingenious intellectual defence of the faith had paid handsome dividends, but soon it was to become apparent that in acquiescing uncritically to the purely rationalistic approach, the opponents of deism had in fact yielded crucial ground. As a result, the entire edifice of revelation was eventually imperilled. It was not until the next century that the full extent of the damage was to be recognised, and by then it was too late. Yet even in Wesley's time the presuppositions of Christianity were being increasingly questioned. A process of incipient demythologizing had already started. Christianity was to be neither mysterious nor miraculous, but basically rational and humane, explains Dr. V. H. Green. The attempt to bring this about, made for the most part by men of mediocre intellectual capacity, diluted the Christian faith to a ludicrous extent. It appeared no longer as a structure of dogma but a moral code, and its founder was simply a good man, neither true saviour nor redeemer. That's in Vivian H. Green's John Wesley, published in 1964. This subtle undermining of Christian foundations lay behind the decline of faith and morals which characterised the first half of the 18th century. It is against such a background that the evangelistic enterprise of John Wesley needs to be set. His task was multilateral. It was not sufficient simply to bemoan the iniquity of the age. The desiccated moralism of the contemporary pulpit had to be replaced by a passionate proclamation of evangelical truth, wherever men and women would listen to it, irrespective of ecclesiastical conventions. Wesley did not waste his time deploring the evils of his day, asserted Richard Pike. He attacked them, and he attacked them by preaching repentance and conversion. He knew that the only hope of the corrupt heart was a new birth. And that's in Richard Pike's book, John Wesley Came This Way, 1938. But more than that, Wesley countered the current wave of rationalistic skepticism with a ringing affirmation of those fundamental and supernatural realities of the gospel which, whilst by no means incompatible with reason, nevertheless transcend and surpass it. To the story of John Wesley's evangelism we must now turn. In concentrating on this pivotal figure, the impression must not be created, however, that Wesley was the only instrument of awakening in this era. We must be careful not to isolate his achievement. As Dr. John Welsh so discerningly reminds us, simple chronology disposes of the stereotype of the whole revival as a chain reaction from the Aldersgate Street experience, and of John Wesley as a solitary Moses striking the rock of petrified Anglicanism to release a sudden stream of revival. In particular, the equivalent significance of George Whitefield is not to be minimised, but this is a book about Wesley, and of necessity the spotlight of attention must be focused on him. Part 1, The Making of an Evangelist. Chapter 1 is called Inner Line, and I'll close by reading this. In John Wesley's letters, I think it's number 76 of volume 5 or something like that. But so far as I can learn, such a thing has scarce been for these 1,000 years before as a son, father, grandfather, atavus, tritavus, preaching the gospel, nay, and the genuine gospel, in a line. So, with a shrewd flash of insight, John Wesley once told Adam Clarke, "If I were to write my own life, I should begin it before I was born." That was his typically realistic way of paying tribute to the past. Ancestry has its effect on personality, and we cannot easily set aside Wesley's family tree. His preparation for the work of evangelism to which God had destined him began long before he came into the world. Like the prophet Jeremiah, he was aware that the divine purpose stretched back to influence his antecedents. "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." That's the 5th verse of Jeremiah chapter 1. Referring to Wesley's untiring ministry throughout the land, Dr. Maldwin Edwards asks, what thrust him out on these ceaseless journeyings? In a strict sense, he replies, one could say it was in his blood. Wesley's pedigree is a fascinating one from a spiritual viewpoint. He himself had no interest in his genealogy for the usual reasons, since he was singularly free from any pride of class or descent. But after his evangelical conversion, and when he had embarked on the mission God gave him, he realized how providentially he had been prepared for it by his family background. For, as Canon Latham reminds us, if we were to trace the goodly heritage of Wesley's ancestry, it would be to discover Puritanism at its intellectual, cultural, and religious best. Wesley spoke of son, father, and grandfather in a line of genuine gospel preaching. We can take it one stage further back, for his great-grandfather also stood in the succession, Bartholomew Wesley. The T in the surname was not dropped until John Wesley's father went up to Oxford, was one of the recognised Puritans during the Commonwealth period, who was ejected from his living in 1662. According to Calamy, he studied medicine as well as divinity at Oxford, and this stood him in good stead when he was driven from his parish and lost his income. Bartholomew Wesley was rector of Charmouth and Capaston in Dorset from about 1640. In 1650, a commission of inquiry visited the parishes to add to an inventory of incumbents and their stipends, and Wesley's name was entered. In September 1651, Charles II escaped to France after the Battle of Worcester. The boat in which he was to reach the vessel which lay in wait for him was delayed, and he and his retinue stayed all night at an inn at Charmouth. Next morning, suspicions were aroused, and the ostler ran to tell the rector, but he was reading morning prayer in the church, and when he had finished, the defeated king had disappeared. Wesley told a friend afterwards, with a touch of humour, that if ever Charles returned, he would be certain to favour long prayers, because he would have surely snapped him if the service had been over sooner. An account of this incident describes Wesley as the puny parson. He was evidently a man of small stature, like his great-grandson, and indeed it seems all the Wesleys. It was from the parish of Allington, near Bridport, that Wesley was removed in 1662. When he actually took this living is not certain. After his ejection, he threw in his lot with the persecuted nonconformists of the area and preached in their assemblies. We are told that he did indeed use a peculiar plainness of speech which hindered his being an acceptable popular preacher. He died in 1671 and was buried in the sea-washed cemetery, according to Professor Martin Schmidt, in distant view of the little Lyme Regis Valley, where in the time of persecution he had held secret services with the few faithful members of his congregation. If we can discern the shape of things to come in Bartholomew Wesley, this was even more marked in the case of his son John. The first in line to bear the name of the great evangelist of the 18th century was indeed a worthy representative. In many striking ways his story anticipated that of his more famous grandson. John Wesley was introduced by Nehemiah Kernock as a brave, witty, scholarly, simple-minded, itinerant evangelist. A portrait of him which has survived reveals his character. Although he wears clerical dress, he looks more like a soldier than a minister, not because he appears aggressive, but by reason of a certain unyielding determination in his aspect and bearing. He was a protégé of John Owen, the Puritan divine, who was Vice-Chancellor of Oxford University. Calamy recorded that Owen had a great kindness towards John Wesley when he was at New Inn Hall, where he studied Oriental languages as well as theology. Amongst his contemporaries were Thomas Goodwin, Stephen Charnock, John Howe, Philip Henry, and Joseph Alleine, all to become shining lights in the Puritan galaxy. On leaving the university, he was associated for a time with John Janeway's particular church at Melcombe Regis, whilst preaching in the district and acting as port chaplain. He became an itinerant evangelist and saw many conversions. In 1658 he was approved by Cromwell's Triers as minister of the parish church at Winterbourne, Whitchurch, although he was not episcopally ordained, and is even said to have preached against episcopacy. He married the daughter of John White, one of the two assessors of the Westminster Assembly, and a thorn in the flesh to Archbishop Laud because of his protest against Arminian doctrine and undue ceremonialism. In 1661, charges were brought against him on the ground of his refusal to use the liturgy of the prayer book. As a result, he was put into prison and in the following year removed from his cure. Calamy recorded an interview which John Wesley had with Gilbert Ironside, the Bishop of Bristol. It was copied from Wesley's own diary, which unfortunately has been lost. John Wesley came across it in 1765 and felt it to be of such importance that he transcribed it in full in his journal. That's volume 5, 25th of May 1765. It so remarkably anticipated the position of the 18th century evangelist that we must examine it with some care. Not unnaturally, the first question put by the bishop concerned the authenticity of Wesley's ordination, if indeed he claimed to be ordained. This was neatly turned, as Wesley simply replied that he had been sent to preach the gospel. "By whom were you sent?" pressed the bishop. "By a Church of Jesus Christ," was the answer. "What church is that?" "The Church of Christ at Melcombe." This was Janeway's congregation. The bishop dismissed it as facetious and heretical, but Wesley stoutly resisted the invitation. In what manner did the church you spake of send you to preach? At this rate, everybody might preach. The bishop continued. Not everyone, responded Wesley. Everybody has not preaching gifts and preaching graces. Besides, that is not all I have to offer to your lordship to justify my preaching. What follows is so vital that we will quote it verbatim. W and B, of course, are abbreviations for Wesley and the bishop. The bishop, if you preach, it must be according to order, the order of the Church of England upon ordination. Wesley, what does your lordship mean by ordination? Bishop, do you not know what I mean? Wesley, if you mean that sentence spoken of in Romans 10, I had it. Bishop, I mean that. What mission had you? Wesley, I had a mission from God and man. Bishop, you must have it according to law and the order of the Church of England. Wesley, I am not satisfied in conscience as touching the ordination you speak of. Bishop, what reason have you that you will not be thus ordained? Wesley, I am not called to office and therefore cannot be ordained. Bishop, why have you preached then all this while? Wesley, I was called to the work of the ministry, though not the office. There is, as we may believe, vocatio ad opus et ad munus, a call to the work and a call to the office. The bishop, why may you not have the office of the ministry? Wesley, may it please your lordship, because they are not a people who are fit subjects for me to exercise office work amongst them. Bishop, you mean a gathered church, but we must have no gathered churches in England, and you will see it so, for there must be a unity without divisions among us, and there can be no unity without uniformity. It will be realized that the raising of such basic issues not only antedated the 18th century, but also our own ecumenical times. Wesley's strongest defence of his ministry lay in his appeal to its fruits among his converts. This was precisely the line taken by his grandson later. Wesley, it pleased God to seal my labour with success in the apparent conversion of many souls. Bishop, yea, that is, it may be to your way. Wesley, yea, to the power of godliness from ignorance and profaneness. If it please your lordship to lay down any evidence of godliness, agreeing with Scripture, and that are not found in those persons intended, I am content to be discharged the ministry. I will stand on full on the issue thereof. The bishop, you talk of the power of godliness such as you fancy. Wesley, yea, to the reality of religion. Let us appeal in any commonplace book for evidence of graces, and they are found in and upon them. Bishop, how many are there of them? Wesley, I number not the people. Bishop, where are they? Wesley, wherever I have been called to preach, at Radpole, Melcombe, Turnwood, Whitchurch, and at sea. I shall add another ingredient of my mission. When the church saw the presence of God going along with me, they did by fasting and prayer, in a day set apart for that end, seek an abundant blessing on my endeavours. Bishop, a particular church? Wesley, yes, my lord, I am not ashamed to own myself a member of one. Bishop, why, you may mistake the apostles' intent. They went about to convert heathens. You have no warrant for your particular churches. Wesley, we have a plain, full, and sufficient rule for gospel worship in the New Testament, recorded in the Acts of the Apostles and in the Epistles. This, however, the bishop flatly denied. He was ready to accept the precepts of the apostles as binding, but not their practice. Wesley insisted on both. The interview closed cordially. It is clear that though Dr. Ironside, as an Episcopalian, could hardly have been expected to have agreed with John Wesley's Puritan arguments, he nevertheless respected the integrity and also the intellectual acumen of this strange young evangelist. Here is how the conversation wound up. Bishop, well then, you will justify your preaching, will you, without ordination according to law? Wesley, all these things laid together are satisfactory to me for my procedure therein. Bishop, they are not enough. Wesley, there has been more written in proof of preaching of gifted persons with such approbation than has been answered yet by anyone. Bishop, have you anything more to say to me, Mr. Wesley? Wesley, nothing. Your lordship sent for me. Bishop, I am glad to hear this from your mouth. You will stand to your principles, you say. Wesley, I intend it through the grace of God and to be faithful to the King's Majesty, however you deal with me. Bishop, I will not meddle with you. Wesley, farewell to you, sir. Bishop, farewell, good Mr. Wesley. Of course, if this was Wesley's conviction, nothing that the bishop might personally feel about him could prevent the law taking its course as it did. Professor Schmidt comments on the bearing of all this on the dilemma in which the 18th century Wesley found himself when, though episcopally ordained, he exercised an itinerant ministry which involved unauthorized intrusion into other men's parishes and employed as his assistants laymen who nevertheless had a clear call to preach. The proud consciousness of having been sent, which yet unreservedly subjects personal activity to the judgment of the Bible, the determination to conform to primitive Christianity, the stress on visible results as the fruit and conversion as a definite aim, all this comes out again in his grandson. Henceforward, John Wesley was to lead the life of a most spirituous nonconformist, as the eccentric antiquarian Noble quaintly designated him. He was hunted from place to place, oft disturbed and several times apprehended and 4 times imprisoned, as Calamy reported. He was in many straits and difficulties, but wonderfully supported and comforted, and many times very seasonably and surprisingly relieved and delivered. He was only 34 when he died, a little before his father. The founder of Methodism was a true successor of this devoted man, declared Telford. His itinerant ministry, his care for the fisher folk, his unflinching loyalty to his principles, his success in winning souls, and his simple godly life were all reproduced in his illustrious grandson. John Wesley's grandfather on his mother's side was one of the most distinguished of the Puritan nonconformists. Indeed, Kernock hailed him as their primate. Dr. Samuel Annesley was ejected from St. Giles, Cripplegate, London, where Oliver Cromwell had been married to Elizabeth Bourchier, and by whose son Richard he had been presented. The only son of a wealthy landowner, he had graduated with honours from Queen's College, Oxford, and in 1648 was awarded the Doctor of Laws degree. From Calamy we learn that he was so early under religious impressions that he declared he knew not the time when he was not converted. He was ordained by presbyters in 1644, and after a period as a naval chaplain, served as rector of Cliffe near Gravesend. In 1652 he was appointed to the Church of St. John the Evangelist in Friday Street, and in 1658 to St. Giles. Both John Fox and John Milton lie buried in this latter historic church. He published a volume of sermons which Schmidt tells us occupy an important place in the literature on the Puritan theology of conscience and the conscience-guided life. His grandson was to use one of these as the basis for a discourse of his own. After his ejection in 1662, Dr. Annesley continued to fulfil his calling as a preacher, and was eventually able with others to found a meeting house at Little St. Helens, Bishopsgate Street, which became the focus of London nonconformity. For more than 30 years he ruled as a patriarch of dissent in the capital, as Schmidt puts it, and it was he who dared to undertake the first public ordination of nonconformist ministers since the Great Ejectment. There is a delightful picture of this venerable man conducting the sacrament of the Lord's Supper at Little St. Helens, painted for us by Samuel Sewall, the New England judge. He went from pew to pew as he administered the elements, dropping pertinent expressions. What he said as he gave the cup to Sewall remained with him for the rest of his life. Stick at nothing for Christ. That was the motto of Annesley's life, as it was to be of John Wesley's. Dr. Annesley married the daughter of another John White, a distinguished Puritan lawyer who was MP for Suffolk. In the Long Parliament, he was appointed as chairman of the Committee for Scandalous Ministers, which was responsible for removing those clergy whose lives were unworthy of their vocation. He was one of the lay assessors at the Westminster Assembly. Thus both John Wesley's great-grandfathers on the maternal side were present at that memorable gathering. One of the most famous of the Wesley portraits is that by the academician John Michael Williams. When Dr. Alexander Maclaren stood before it, he exclaimed, now I have seen the man who moved England." "No one can look at Williams's painting," claimed Dr. Simon, "without seeing Wesley's Puritan ancestors looking out from the canvas." The bibliographer Richard Green was correct in describing Wesley's face in this portrait as being of the Miltonic type. Indeed, unnamed engravings of Wesley and Milton have sometimes been confused. Dean Hutton rightly referred to Wesley's hereditary determination and even conscientious obstinacy, which made him run rather against than with the current. Some would conclude, he added, that Wesley had nonconformity in his blood. On the other hand, we must take equal cognizance of the fact that both his parents were convinced Anglicans. However impressive may be Wesley's Puritan inheritance, it remains the case that his immediate legacy was one of devotion to the Church of England. It is indeed in this combination of influences that the clue to Wesley is to be discovered. In his make-up, Anglican and Puritan were fused, as Cadman put it, the order and dignity of the one, the fearless initiative and asceticism of the other. These elements were also integrated in the personalities of Wesley's parents, for with all their firm attachment to the established church, they were no more able to sever themselves entirely from the past than their son. The roof of Epworth Rectory, where John was born on the 17th of June 1703, covered two strands of English Christian tradition. As A.W. Harrison expressed it, the Epworth parsonage had a high church atmosphere, yet it was essentially a Puritan home. John Wesley's father Samuel was intended for the dissenting ministry. He was born in the ominous year 1662, and had not reached his 8th birthday when the family was bereaved of its earthly head. His childhood reflected the deprivations endured by those who suffered for conscience's sake. Until he was 14, he went to the free school in Dorchester, where his teacher was Henry Dollin, who had made a name for himself as the translator into Latin of a Caroline Manual of Devotion, The Whole Duty of Man. It was published in 1659. Lady Dorothy Packington, wife of a prominent royalist, was for long credited with the authorship, but the tendency of more recent literary criticism has been to attribute it to Richard Allestree, Provost of Eton from 1665. Through the generosity of nonconformist benefactors, Samuel Wesley was sent to a dissenting academy in Stepney, where Edward Veal, an Oxford man, was principal. Later he moved to a similar college at Stoke Newington under Charles Morton, who eventually became vice president of Harvard University. One of his fellow students was Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe. It appeared that Samuel was all set for a vocation as a minister in the nonconformist churches. Then came a quite unpredictable turn of events. As part of his educational exercises, he was required to refute an Anglican diatribe against the dissenters. As he weighed the evidence, he was driven to the conclusion that the objections were valid. It was typical of the man he eventually became that as a youth he should react impetuously to this discovery. He decided to make a clean break with family tradition. With him, it must be either one thing or the other. He now espoused the course of episcopacy as earnestly as he had formerly championed dissent. Henceforward the Church of England had no more wholehearted protagonist than Samuel Wesley. The university was thus open to him, and he tramped off to Oxford with just enough in his pocket to pay the entrance fee. He worked his way through his classes by earning money from tuition and preparing exercises for others. Thus he equipped himself for orders. As Professor Schmidt makes clear, the unusual course his life had taken explains the two features which subsequently characterized his outlook. On the one hand, He always owed a great deal to the Puritan emphasis upon the importance of repentance, conversion, and rebirth. On the other hand, he had the historical interest of the Enlightenment. He was ordained deacon on 7th of August 1689 and priest on the 24th of February 1690. And the dates throughout are cited New Style. In actual fact, before the Calendar Act of 1750 came into force in September 1752, the legal year was reckoned from 25th of March. Without this explanation, Smith's statement that Samuel Wesley was ordained deacon on 7th of August and priest on 24th of February 1689 would be mystifying to the uninitiate. In speaking of Samuel Wesley as a high churchman, it is important to define our terms. Although the designations Low Church and High Church had already appeared, they had not yet acquired the connotation with which we are today familiar. We must be aware of interpreting early altitudinarianism in terms of 19th century Tractarian predilections, or even of developing theories in the late 18th century. Samuel Wesley's high churchmanship was more political and ecclesiastical than doctrinal and sacerdotal. He was vigorously opposed to dissent, so strong was his reaction against his upbringing, and warmly upheld the crown, although he found no difficulty in transferring his allegiance to the House of Orange. But in his theological convictions he remained a true friend to the Protestant cause, as More put it, and he did not jettison the reformed principles which he had imbibed in his youth. His abiding interest in biblical exegesis was derived from his Puritan training. In a letter to John Smith in 1748, John Wesley referred to his father's views. He was acquainted with the faith of the gospel, of the primitive Christians, and of our first reformers, the same which, by the grace of God, I preach, which is just as new as Christianity. It is significant that John Wesley included his father in the line of those in the family before him who preached the genuine gospel. On his deathbed, Samuel confided to John, "The inward witness, son, the inward witness, that is the proof, the strongest proof of Christianity." Those words harked back to a typical Puritan emphasis, and also looked forward to John Wesley's teaching on assurance. In many ways, Susanna Wesley was the dominant personality in the Epworth household. Samuel had married her in 1688, and she brought with her a unique endowment. As the daughter of Dr. Annesley, she inherited a rich tradition. The Annesley home was an outstanding example of a Puritan household, observes Dr. Robert C. Monk, whose demanding educational standards accompanied disciplined, devotional, and moral teaching. In addition, since this was a centre of nonconformity, the children were exposed to intense theological discussion. In the early years of his ministry, John Wesley still turned to his mother for advice on controverted points of doctrine, but like her husband, Susanna was to turn from the path of dissent and find her home in the Anglican fold. This was a decision she reached at the ripe age of 13, and she never went back on it. Yet it would be a mistake to think that she forgot her nonconformist background. According to Rupert Davis, the dissenting principles she had ostensibly renounced never ceased to flow in her blood. The distinctive features both of her personal devotions and of the instructions she gave to her children were predominantly Puritan. Although expressed within the framework of Anglicanism, her emphases were largely those which she had carried over from nonconformity. She read widely in both the Anglican and Roman divines, but she still found food for her soul in the Puritan classics. Her spiritual life reflects at many points the impress of her Puritan upbringing, writes Dr. John A. Newton. Her carefully ordered timetable, her regular times set apart for meditation and self-examination before God, her keeping of a spiritual journal or daybook, her observance of the strict Puritan Sabbath, these were all part of her method of life, to use the Puritan keyword which was current long before John Wesley began his work. It is not too much to say, therefore, with Newton, that Wesley absorbed Puritan influences with his mother's milk. The effect of this mingled Anglican and Puritan inheritance on John Wesley was marked. he remained a Church of England man to his dying day, with a strong sense of discipline and a desire to bring about reform from within. He loved the liturgy and was persuaded that the articles and homilies enshrined the essentials of the evangelical faith. Yet as he pursued his task of mission, we find him adopting expedients more in keeping with the spirit of his nonconformist ancestors. His overriding concern was for the good of souls, and where existing church order stood in his way, he did not hesitate to let it aside. The rebel under the skin would keep bursting through. And God willing, next week, some of these chapters are only 9 pages long, so I'm going to read to you chapter 2 and chapter 3, chapter 2 being taken out of the flames, and 3 the continued endeavour. So, until then, as always, may God bless you all. Amen.